All right, so I'm going to talk about totalitarianism in Italy and Germany today. I talked already about totalitarianism in Russia. So there in the center we see Stalin. His form of totalitarianism is a communist form. So if we look at that political spectrum at the bottom, you can see that communism is on the far left. He wants to remake the world as it is. And so he is looking to destroy existing social systems and to completely change the economic system and all of that. Whereas fascism is on the far right. And so in a lot of ways, fascists are looking backwards. They want to revive old ways of doing things like keeping women in the home and making sure that women have lots of children, getting rid of all the rights that people had gained as individuals, and instead give them rights as members of groups. And so they think that having rights as individuals splinters the nation, breaks it apart, and fascism is an ultra-nationalistic ideology. And so although fascism and communism can look very similar, we can have dictators in both cases, we can have extreme loyalty to the state in both cases, they are coming at this dictatorship from opposite directions. So I'm going to go through the Italian version of fascism first, and then I'll talk about Nazism in Germany. So if you do have any questions, if you just post it, hopefully our bandwidth holds for today. Okay, so Italian fascism is at least aiming to be a form of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a form of government where the government is attempting to influence the way people think. So they want to control education, and they want to control the media, radio at that point. They want to shape the way that you view the world. So the Italian fascists will be less successful at this than the Nazis will be in Germany, but they're still aiming for that. So let's look at where this comes from. The source of Italian nationalism is the First World War. Italy was on the winning side in that war, and yet got very little. So when Austria-Hungary breaks up, if we look at that map on the top right-hand corner, then we can see that a little bit of it goes to Italy, but otherwise Austria-Hungary's territory goes to new countries like Yugoslavia. And so the Italians are bitter about that. When the war ends, debt is very high in most of the countries that participated. And so that causes unemployment to be high, it causes inflation. And so in Italy, the economic situation is bad. And so think about it this way. When economics are awful, then people are drawn to extremes. And one of the extremes that people were drawn to was communism. Okay, so remember, the communists are saying that the workers of the world are going to unite. They're going to overthrow the capitalist system and redistribute wealth so that everybody has their fair share. So to an unemployed worker, that sounds really appealing, especially because your mainstream political parties were usually saying that it's in a capitalist system, there's nothing they can do. They just have to wait for the business cycle to recover, and things will be better off when it does. So this wait and see message from your mainstream parties was not something the workers wanted to hear. Well, the problem with communism from the perspective of workers is that communism is an international set of ideas. So workers of the world are uniting. It doesn't matter if you're Italian or German or Polish or Russian. All workers across the world are going to unite. And so for soldiers coming back from World War I who were pretty patriotic and nationalistic, they wanted a party that met their needs. And so that party didn't exist in most of the countries after World War I. The parties that were patriotic tended to be capitalistic and say that the government had to stay out of the economy. The parties that said that the government could get involved in the economy tended to be international and not patriotic. And so that's what prompts Mussolini, the founder of the fascist party in Italy, to create this party. He is looking to create a party that is going to draw in workers who are patriotic and kind of pull them away from the communists. So from the start, Mussolini is identifying the communists as his number one enemy. And so the form of fascism we see emerge in Italy, the original form of fascism, is ultra-patriotic, but not necessarily racist. So what Mussolini is promoting is this idea that he's going to revive the old Roman Empire. So that at one point, Italy was something of a center of the world. Rome was the central capital in that part of the world, and he wants to go back to that. That's the propaganda, and so the kind of the way this works is Mussolini is drawing in a lot of the young men who had fought in the war. For those young men who had fought in the war, remember that World War I was a bloody stalemate, and so they don't see the use of violence as being all that bad a thing. For them, it's not that big a deal to use violence in politics because they've become kind of numb to the violence. And so he's able to recruit a lot of these former soldiers into this group in the bottom left-hand corner, the black shirts. So this is kind of a paramilitary group that the fascists have. They would go around intimidating people who might vote for the communists or beating up people before elections. So there's this question about Mussolini being a communist. He was not a communist, but he was a socialist. And so that's where he gets the idea that there needs to be a set of ideas that will help the workers, because he likes that about socialism. But as a result of World War I being a total war, he is rejecting this idea of an international community. And so he would have claimed that fascism takes the best elements of socialism, which is this help for workers who are part of the nation, but it couples it with extreme nationalism rather than an international kind of outlook. And so Mussolini is drawing in a lot of these dissatisfied former soldiers. So what he does in the period after World War I is he convinces a lot of people that his version of nationalism is more in their interest than, say, a conservative party's version of nationalism, and he is using this violence against the communists. So what he decides to do in 1922 is kind of force the issue. In Italy, there was still a constitutional monarchy, so the king could appoint the prime minister who actually ran the government. So Mussolini organizes a fascist march on Rome, and that march was intended to pressure the king into naming Mussolini the prime minister. So here, the conservatives are at a crossroads. What can they do? Well, they can crush the march, which was well within their ability. Mussolini only had maybe 50,000 people marching on Rome. The Italian army was much bigger. But they were afraid, the conservatives who ran the government were afraid that if they did that, then the communists would seize power. Remember, 1922 is just 5 years after the Russian Revolution in 1917, when the Bolsheviks did seize power. So there's this example of the communists taking control in a nearby country that is alarming to people. There's something of a Red Scare in Italy during this time. So the other alternative then is for the king to give in to Mussolini and name him prime minister. And so the thinking went that they could use Mussolini as a weapon against the communists. They would turn him loose, crush the communists, and then the feeling was Mussolini wasn't a serious enough politician to last long. Eventually, the traditional conservatives would be able to replace him. So in a parliamentary government, remember, the majority party is usually the party that chooses a prime minister. And so what the Italians were faced with is a situation where no single party had a majority. You have to form a coalition, an alliance of parties, in order to have a governing group. And so the conservatives kind of talked themselves into this idea that they could form a governing group with the fascists, crush the communists, and then go back to the way things were. And this fails, right? Because once Mussolini is prime minister, then he has a lot more control over the police. He has a lot more control over the court system. And he is basically able to manipulate it to suit his needs. So slowly but surely, from 1922 to 1925, Mussolini accumulates more and more power. And he starts off by targeting the communists and outlining the Communist Party and extreme socialist parties. And then he moves on to outlining all of the other parties. And so by the time we get to 1925, Mussolini has consolidated a dictatorship in Italy. And for a lot of Italians, his government was preferable to the system that they had before. Because Mussolini, we talked about this with Napoleon earlier on, he restored order. The famous line during his day was Mussolini made the trains run on time. And so for the first time, the economy seemed to be clicking after World War I. And so people around the world, not just in Italy, gave Mussolini credit for this. There were a lot of American politicians who said things like, Mussolini is a good fit for the Italian people. The Italian people are not suited for democracy. They need a strong man to be in control. And so coming after World War I, the worst war in human history, there was a feeling that democracy only worked in Anglo-American types of situations. So if people who were of English descent could make it work, nobody else could. And so the dictatorship that he establishes, that he consolidates control over, is going to build what's called a cult of personality. Cult of personality is where you build up a leader to kind of a godlike standing. We see it today in North Korea. The North Korean leader is referred to as the great leader. And every radio message, or every day, the radio message begins with some message from the great leader. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the fascist headquarters, which is something straight out of some kind of dystopian novel, 1984 or something like that. Mussolini's slogan was "Mussolini is always right." The journalists who wrote about Mussolini in Italy were required to capitalize the H in he or him as if Mussolini was God. And so there is that consolidation we see. And so the fascist movement then is going to spread as a result of Mussolini's success. And so when we get to the German situation, Mussolini is going to achieve power as a result of World War I prior to the rise of Hitler. And so for Hitler, Mussolini is something of a role model. All right, so let's kind of go back and examine Hitler. So the legend about Hitler is that he has Jewish heritage, and there's probably some truth to that. We don't know who his father's father was. We know that his grandmother worked for a Jewish household, and she got pregnant before she got married. Often, domestic servants in that day would have relationships with the young men in the household they were working for. So it is quite possible that one of his grandparents was Jewish. Now his father was not born into the Hitler family. He actually was adopted and took on the name Hitler. His name originally was Schicklgruber, which would have had a much different ring. Hail Schicklgruber, not quite the same inspiring sense of terror there. So Hitler was born in Austria. He was German. The people who ran Austria were German speaking. There were a large number of Austrian or Germans in what is now Austria. And so he went to Vienna and tried to enter the art school there. In the bottom left-hand corner, we see a painting by Hitler where they told him that he wasn't quite good enough to be an artist. Apparently something with his depiction of human features kind of ruled him out, but that he would be great as an architect, because architects need to have artistic ability too. Well, Hitler needed a few more classes to become an architect, and basically too lazy, too uninspired to do that, and ends up spending all his money and going to shows in Vienna, and is eventually homeless and has to go back home. And so Hitler later claimed that he became anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic during his time in Vienna, but there's not a whole lot of evidence from that time period that shows that he was. What seems to have made him anti-Semitic is the First World War. And so in the bottom right-hand corner, we see Hitler with his World War I, with his World War I regiment. He was a runner during World War I, which meant that he was one of the people who physically carried messages when lines of communication were cut. He had joined the German army, so the Germans opened recruitment to any German Austrian who wanted to join. And people like Hitler didn't want to join the Austro-Hungarian army. They were patriots, they were Germans. They wanted to join the German army. And he was totally taken in by the stab in the back legend, by the idea that Germany lost the war because they were betrayed. And so Hitler is going to come back from World War I, bitter about how it ended, ultra nationalistic, and feeling like Mussolini that there is no party for him. And again, in Germany, the traditional patriotic parties were capitalist conservative parties. They said things like, there's nothing we can do to help unemployed soldiers. It's just part of the business cycle. Eventually the business cycle will come around and you'll get a job. And so Hitler then forms a party that is his own version of fascism. And the name of the party itself is a version of propaganda because he calls it the National Socialist Party. So it's the full name, the German Workers' National Socialist Party. So it's got everything in there, right? It's nationalistic and it's socialist. Really wasn't socialist, but what he meant there was the same thing Mussolini did, which is that he considered all workers to be a valuable part of the nation. And he was going to ensure that all of the soldiers that came back that couldn't find jobs had jobs. And so it's during this period that we first find his really anti-Jewish writings. And so he thinks he can follow in Mussolini's footsteps. Like Mussolini had a group of black shirts as his gang of thugs that went around beating up people. Hitler forms the brown shirts, the SA, that did the same thing. Just like Mussolini targeted the communists, so does Hitler. And so the next step is for Hitler to imitate Mussolini's march on Rome and seize power. And that's what he does try to do. And his base of support was in the southern part of Germany, in Munich. And so he launches what is known as the Beer Hall Putsch. And so you can see over here on the right-hand side. It starts in a beer hall in Munich. He had recruited one of the leading generals from World War I, Ludendorff, to help him. But it's poorly organized. The German conservatives were not on his side at this point. So unlike Mussolini, whose march is successful, this march is just a dud. It fails before it can even get going. Well, one of the problems for the government of Germany at this point, which was a democratic republic, so it's a government called the Weimar Republic. One of the problems is that the Weimar Republic was basically built on top of the old German Empire. And so the judges in the Weimar Republic tended to be the old judges from Wilhelm II's reign. And so they tended to go light on conservatives because they were conservative themselves. So what Hitler has tried to do is basically overthrow the government. It's treason. And he gets 5 years in prison for it. And you can see in the center the pictures of him in prison. It's not really prison. He had his personal secretary there. He dictates his book while in prison, which is Mein Kampf. And so in Mein Kampf, Hitler told you everything you would need to know about what he aims to do. He talks about his anti-Semitism. He talks about how he wants to expand into Eastern Europe. Basically what Hitler outlines here is a further progression of social Darwinism. So we talked about social Darwinism being a misapplication of scientific ideas that came from Darwin. The social Darwinists were claiming that Europeans had industrialized first because they were superior racially. They had better characteristics. So if you believe that people have better characteristics, then there's kind of this natural progression that we would walk through. So some races are superior to others. If evolution is about ensuring that the best traits are passed on and those that aren't so good aren't passed on, then you're going to limit marriage between races. You're going to eventually forcibly sterilize certain groups of people, right? And then we're one step away at that point from extermination. And Mein Kampf never comes right out and says that Hitler wants to exterminate the Jews, but he's setting a course in that direction already in the 1920s. And so the tragedy is that people believed that Hitler had written Mein Kampf when he was immature and in prison and embittered, and it wasn't really what he thought. And that as a leader in Germany, he would be matured by the position of leadership, and that he would act in a different way once he took power. So that's in the 1920s. So when we look at the 1920s, then what we see is that the Nazi Party is a fringe party. So if you look at the electoral graph on the right, in 1928, the Nazis, that red stripe on the far left of that graph, have just a handful of seats in the German legislature, which is the Reichstag. And so the kind of setting this up is we have World War I, the worst war ever, and Germany loses. And then we have a period of hyperinflation. And so if you look at the chart there right under where it says inflation, it says that in 1923, $1, one American dollar, would get you 350,000 marks. That was inflated over the 1914 number. In 1914, before World War I broke out, $1 would get you 4 marks. So we can see that a lot of inflation has already occurred. This is because of the debt. When a country goes into debt, it's like printing more money. So then the Germans go into what's called hyperinflation. And you can see that by 1923, $1 is equal to trillions of marks. The dollar is the mark, the currency of Germany, is essentially worthless. There are all kinds of pictures of children using marks as building blocks, and people heating their furnace with marks. Eventually, Germany recovers from this, though. So what happens is the United States begins to loan the Germans a lot of money. And so you get the kind of flow chart that you have in the middle bottom there, the international financial system under the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. The United States is loaning money to Germany, which enables the Germans to bring this inflation under control and pay the reparations to the Allies. And the Allies can then pay their war debt back to the United States. So this all depends on the American economy remaining strong. And there's bad news, right? Because in 1929, the Great Depression hits. The American economy collapses, which causes the German economy to collapse. And so we have this cycle that you go through. What occurs is, you can see there the unemployment chart. So it reaches its peak in 1932. When people are unemployed, they can't buy as much. When people can't buy as much, prices actually go down, right? This is deflation. Deflation can actually be as harmful as inflation, because when prices drop, then that means companies aren't making as much money. When companies don't make as much money, they fire more people. And so again, your traditional parties don't really do anything to solve this problem. All right, so this is to give you an example of the platform that Hitler ran for office on. So when Hitler ran for office, he did from time to time mention his anti-Semitic views, but you can see in this campaign ad that it's basically on the fringe. It's tangential. Its main point is that Germany has been sabotaged by the American economic system. And so the American economic system has provoked this world crisis and has kept Germany in debt, what he calls interest slavery, right? He does bring in his anti-Semitic views when he references Wall Street, referencing what was a long-standing stereotype of the Jews, that they controlled banking. And so he is talking about that. But then he goes on to say that the American system, the American global system, puts machine over man. It annihilates the independent farmer. It achieves this control through democracy, and he calls this the swindle of democracy. In the economic sphere, it's through control of credit, right? He keeps you in debt, this American banker. And so this is an appeal not to anti-Semitic views as much as to the economic interest of the voters. Kind of the flip side of this is Hitler is saying that he will break away from this American capitalist system and put you back to work. And so remember, your traditional parties were more likely to go to the Americans and seek some kind of loan or debt forgiveness than they were to tell the Americans what Hitler is telling them, which is, we will not pay you back. I'm going to use German money on the German people. And so during an economic depression, that's a really popular message. And so just like we saw with Mussolini, what Hitler is doing is he's drawing in a lot of these former soldiers who are patriotic, who wanted the government to do something to help them out, and felt like the mainstream parties weren't helping them and the Communist Party was too international. So this is what leads to Hitler seizing power. So you can see in the top right, German unemployment and Nazi vote shares. Basically, as unemployment goes up, so do the Nazi vote shares. And so if you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the graph there, we can exclude 1933 because in 1933 the Nazis had outlawed all the other parties. That's why they have all of the seats. But you can see how the Nazis were the fastest growing party. So remember, in a parliamentary system, if one party doesn't have over 50% of the seats in the Reichstag, then you have to form an alliance. And so here's the choice for your traditional conservatives. They can either concede to the communists and socialists and allow the communists and the socialists to form a coalition, or they have to form a coalition with the Nazis. And so like we saw in Italy, what they talked themselves into is this idea that they can use Hitler as a weapon against the communists who were gaining, you can see there, gaining votes as well. And then they thought either his time in power would mature him and he would stop talking about things like anti-Semitism, or they would get rid of him, they thought. Okay, so just as we saw in Italy, Hitler is essentially named the prime minister. In Germany, that was called the chancellor. So the president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, named Hitler the chancellor. Hitler more or less becomes chancellor legally. I mean, I say more or less because he did use illegal means like beating up people and intimidating voters. But he is named chancellor in the constitutional way. And so in 1933, when he is chancellor, he can be easily replaced. Paul von Hindenburg, the president, can fire Hitler at will. And so what happens is nobody really does anything to control Hitler. And it's clear from the start where this is going. And there's already intimidation of Jews. Now, the racial laws don't come until Hitler has consolidated control. But what Hitler is going to do next is he's going to use an event as an excuse to take even more power. And that's the Reichstag fire. So the Reichstag, remember, is the German legislature. The building catches on fire, and the authorities conveniently catch a communist who is held responsible for the fire. So the Nazis then use this to build up fear that the communists are doing this because they intend to seize control, and that this is part of some kind of communist conspiracy. And that is really effective. It gets a lot of the other more traditional representatives in the Reichstag to vote for what's called the Enabling Act. The Enabling Act gives Hitler a wide range of emergency powers and allows him to take even greater control over the police forces of Germany. And so we see kind of this steady increase in power, the same as we did in Italy. But the tragedy, knowing what comes next, is any number of things could have derailed Hitler in 1933, 1934. If the United States had put Germany on its do not travel list, that probably would have brought Hitler's government down. Hindenburg probably would have fired him and found some other way of running the country. But the United States didn't. We were more interested in trying to get the Nazis to pay back their war debt than we were in bringing him down. And a lot of Americans talked themselves into the worst stories about Hitler being propaganda and the media just trying to sell newspapers and get listeners. And so people didn't take it as seriously as they should have. And so that enables Hitler by 1935 to establish a dictatorship. So when Hindenburg, the president, dies, Hitler combines the power of president and chancellor into one position. And from that point on, he's known as the Führer. And so when he has that position, now there is no threat within Germany. There's nobody who can just replace him. So what we see at that part is what the Nazis refer to as Nazification. They are going to try to make Germany more like the Nazi Party, to have it reflect Nazi ideas. And so in 1933, you can see all the other parties are outlawed. Hindenburg allows that. And then in 1935, Hitler is the Führer. So what Hitler had announced as a candidate for office is that he was going to dismantle the Versailles Treaty, which was another really popular message in Germany. And right from the start, he begins to do that. And you can see that it's really in 1935, when he has total control, that he begins to increase defense expenditures. And so you have this rearmament that occurs in violation of the Peace of Versailles. When we go over the background of World War II, you're going to see that there are a number of stages in Hitler's dismantling of the treaty. At any of those stages, at any point, Hitler could easily have been overthrown by some outside power. All right, so if we kind of look at this from looking at the difference between communists and fascists. So a communist that wanted to rearm would have at least defended it as part of international communism. So communists could be patriotic and nationalists, but at least ideologically, in terms of their philosophy, it's an international movement. So when the Soviet Union begins to build up its army, it doesn't say this is so we can defend the Soviet Union, although it was. They said that it was so that they could export communism and they could defend the communist movement across the continent. So Hitler, on the other hand, is rearming explicitly as part of German nationalism. And so he is saying they're doing this to protect the German nation, not as part of any type of international movement. Now, the other big difference is that when the Soviet Union begins to industrialize in the 1930s in particular, the government controls everything. The government owns all the businesses. The government controls all workers, at least in theory. In a fascist system, that's not how it works. The state guides rearmament, and Hitler's government sets quotas for the production of arms. But Hitler's government does not control directly the economy. And so that's a big difference between them as well. So although it was Hitler's policy that led to rearmament, it was through these privately held companies. Some of them are still around today. Like the two brothers that owned BMW, the car company, were really involved in Hitler's economic policies. So in the Soviet Union, what would have happened is Stalin would have taken BMW from those two owners and run it through the government. In Germany, the government is directing BMW to produce armaments but does not take it over. So that's a huge difference between the two. But one of the noteworthy things here is how much Germany is spending on armaments prior to World War II. So in the United States, it's often said that World War II got us out of the Depression. You don't need a world war to get out of a depression. You just need the government to put people back to work. So the government is hiring people to make weapons or to serve as soldiers, which means you have money, you can buy things. When you have money and you can buy things, that causes demand to go up, it causes prices to go up, and that can cause recovery. So what Hitler does essentially is he spends for World War II before there's a World War II. And this does get Germany out of the Depression, but it was an inadvertent side effect. Hitler had very little understanding of economics. He wanted a big army, and it just so happened that creating a big army got Germany out of the Depression. But we can see how this would have resulted in a lot of people outside of Germany thinking that Hitler's way was the correct way, that Hitler had figured out how to deal with the crises of the 20th century and democratic leaders hadn't. And so that means, if we look at the chart in the top right, the Allied powers are going to have to play catch up. They're coming from behind when it comes to military spending. So that is one way that he is attacking the Versailles Treaty and that he is building up this pro-German nationalistic military force. All right, now I started by talking about social Darwinism when I went over Hitler's anti-Semitism. So I just want you to take a minute and read this. This is a Virginia law that was in place when Hitler was in power. Okay, so let me kind of break down what we've got going on here. This is a law that enabled forced sterilization to happen. So you could have an operation on somebody so that they could not produce children. And so it's during the eugenics movement, that's part of social Darwinism. It's an idea that some people have better traits than others, some people have bad traits. So if you were a troublemaker and you constantly got into trouble as a child, and then as a teenager, that could be a sign that you just had bad characteristics. So your parents under this law could have you sterilized against your will. And so that would prevent you from passing on these bad traits. So you can see that it was even upheld by the Supreme Court, which tells you just how popular these ideas were and how accepted eugenics was at this point. And it mentions the racial connection. The group that was targeted above all others in this, in terms of percentage, was Native Americans. There was one registrar in Virginia who basically committed statistical genocide on the Native Americans, tried to wipe them out statistically. And so if we're at the stage in the 1920s and 1930s where even in a democratic country, people accept eugenics to such a degree that they're willing to allow parental or state forced sterilization, then it gives you an idea of what Hitler's dealing with. So when we take these ideas and we put them in the hands of a totalitarian leader who can create a Hitler Youth to convince people at a young age to follow his ideas and run schools and create textbooks, then we know where this is headed. And so the combination of this as an existing view and totalitarianism will lead to the Holocaust. But we also want to understand that Hitler, in a lot of ways, was a man of his time. And he is taking the ideas that we see embedded here to what were considered by people like Hitler their natural conclusion. If you're sterilizing people so they can't pass on traits, then it's one step away from just eliminating those people from the population altogether so they can't pass on their traits. And so the ideas about controlling that kind of racial mixing were already out there when Hitler took power. Hitler's idea that the Germans were the master race, he didn't create that idea. He got that from other thinkers of the day. He applies them in a more horrifying way, in a more devastating way than anybody else, for sure. But he is taking the ideas of the late 19th and 20th century to their conclusion. And so where this starts is when Hitler becomes the dictator. So let's start with this. Anti-Semitism, this is anti-Jewish feeling. There had been a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe. And so the Germans, in fact, were not considered the most anti-Semitic. In Eastern Europe, in places like Poland and in Russia, you had outbreaks of violence against Jews called pogroms. And those outbreaks of violence often occurred with government support. And so the government wasn't necessarily organizing the acts of violence, but police would just stand by and watch, and the courts wouldn't do anything afterwards. And so this history of anti-Semitism goes back at least until the Crusades, around 1100. And so that is because Jews were considered to be outsiders. So if we take this idea of German nationalism, if you were a German patriot, an ultra-nationalistic German, Hitler would have said, you needed to be German in all ways, which means you ate German foods and you followed what he would consider the German religion, which was Christianity. And so Jews were never going to fit into that model. But we should clarify here that Hitler doesn't mean that he is against the Jewish religion. He's against the Jews as a race. He believes that there is a Jewish race that he can target, and that carries on these bad traits that he wants to eliminate. So he is fanning the flames of this long history of anti-Semitism. And so you have anti-Semitic views plus totalitarian control leading to greater anti-Semitism. And so in the bottom right, you have one of the posters for the Nazi movies that were produced during the time. At the bottom middle, you see the picture of rats. In a lot of these anti-Semitic movies, Jews were directly or indirectly compared to rats. And so if you have rats, you exterminate them, is kind of the message. And so without saying that that's his plan, he is kind of prepping people to think that way. Where this really gets going is with the Nuremberg laws, which strips Jews of citizenship. So it prevents Jews and Germans from mixing in a lot of different ways. They can't engage in certain businesses together. They can't marry each other. All of this is laid down by the Nuremberg laws. So that is step one. So during the pre-war period, though, Hitler doesn't really engage in full-blown acts of violence against Jews. Where this starts to change is in 1938 with Kristallnacht, which is more or less a pogrom, an act of violence against Jews that was kind of indirectly run, tolerated, orchestrated by the Nazi Party and the government. And so it's at this point that we begin to see where this is heading. And so one of the tragedies here is that for the Jews, there was often nowhere to go. America's immigration laws at this point restricted immigration, particularly from Eastern Europe. So if you were Albert Einstein and you had a high level of education, we would let you in. But otherwise, the United States turned away Jews who wanted to come to the United States. And so did the British, and so did the French. And so this is creating in Hitler's mind a sense that there is what they call a Jewish problem. And in his mind, we know the solution, what they call the Nazis, the final solution to the Jewish problem is extermination. And so where we are headed next is Hitler acting on his ultra-nationalistic and anti-Semitic views more forcefully and directly than before. His nationalism is going to lead him to expand Germany's frontiers. In Hitler's mind, all German-speaking people should live within his German empire. So the Austrians, the people in Czechoslovakia who are German, the people in Poland who are German, they all needed to be in Germany. And so he's going to look to expand. And as he expands into areas where there are large numbers of Jews, this is going to lead to the Holocaust and the extermination of those populations. So an upbeat ending, I know, but the fascist kind of big picture here is that for a lot of people, they saw democracy as poorly suited to handling things like total war and depression. And meanwhile, it seemed like fascism was the wave of the future. It could handle the depression, and it could handle the issues with nationalism of the day. And so many more people were turning in this direction. Spain will become fascist. A version of it will catch on in Brazil. And so if you were living in the 1930s, you would think democracy was on the way out. And so it's a kind of a warning of the danger of overreacting to things, because by the time we get to the 1950s, fascism will have disappeared in most places.